The Texas sun beat down on the lone cabin, a speck in the vast, unforgiving plains. Inside, a pregnant widow, her heart, a drum of anxious grief, clutched a worn rifle. She was alone, isolated by tragedy and the endless horizon. But when a child's cry pierced the air, not of her own blood, but of the very people she'd been taught to fear, she didn't hesitate. Little did she know her act of raw courage, saving a Comanche boy from a pack of savage coyotes, would not be the end of her trial. It was merely the beginning. Days later, the earth would tremble, not with thunder, but with the hooves of 100 warriors, their faces painted for war, their eyes fixed on her tiny, vulnerable home. The silence was the first thing that truly ate at Isabella May Donovan. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping town or the gentle hush of a forest. It was a vast, predatory silence, the kind that swallowed sounds whole and left a ringing in your ears. It was the silence of the Texas plains in 1878. A land that promised everything and gave nothing but dust, wind, and a sky so wide it could break a person's spirit. Her husband, Jebediah, had loved it. He'd seen promise in the endless sea of grass, a future in the rich, dark soil that clung to their boots. "This is God's country, Izzy," he'd say, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners as he surveyed their small plot of land, the single-room cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, standing defiant against the horizon. "A place to make our own way, beholden to no one." Now Jebediah was part of that soil. 6 months ago, a rattlesnake, coiled innocently in the woodpile, had stolen him from her, its venom a swift and merciless thief. It had been just the 2 of them, their dreams as big as the sky. Now it was just her, the silence and the new life growing within her, a secret she and Jebediah had celebrated for only a week before he was gone. At 24, Isabella was a widow, and soon she would be a mother. Her face, framed by waves of auburn hair that had once been her pride, was now pale and etched with a weariness that went beyond her burgeoning belly. Her hands, once soft and nimble at the piano in her father's Boston parlor, were now calloused and raw from chopping wood, tending the meager garden, and scrubbing clothes on a rough washboard. Her nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, were a 2-day ride away. They were good people. Martha Henderson had even offered to take her in, but Isabella had refused. This cabin, this small patch of earth, was all she had left of Jebediah. To leave it would be like burying him a second time. So she stayed her world, shrinking to the 4 walls of the cabin, the small vegetable patch, and the well-worn path to the creek. Her only companions were the elements. The wind, a constant mournful whistler, clawed at the chinking between the logs of her cabin. The sun was a relentless tyrant, baking the ground into a cracked mosaic. And then there were the nights filled with the yips and howls of coyotes, a sound that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. They were getting bolder, their cries sounding closer each evening. One sweltering afternoon, as Isabella was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 scraggly mesquite trees, a sound unlike the usual prairie symphony reached her ears. It was a cry, a human cry, sharp and terrified. Her hand, holding a wooden clothespin, froze mid-air. She scanned the horizon, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. The prairie could play tricks on you, the heat and the wind conspiring to create phantom sounds. But this was no trick. It came again, a high-pitched scream of pure terror, followed by the frenzied, snarling yaps of coyotes. Her blood ran cold. It was a child. Without a second thought, Isabella dropped the wet sheet into the dust and ran into the cabin. Her hands trembling, But Shur reached for Jebediah's Winchester rifle resting on its pegs above the fireplace. She checked the chamber, loaded, always loaded. She grabbed a handful of extra cartridges from a small leather pouch and shoved them into the pocket of her apron. Her pregnancy, now in its 7th month, made her clumsy. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she moved her belly, a heavy, awkward weight. She pushed it down, the fear for the unknown child overriding her own discomfort. Stepping out onto the porch, she squinted against the blinding sun, trying to pinpoint the source of the commotion. It was coming from the direction of the creek, about 1/4 of a mile away, where a small clutch of cottonwood trees offered a sliver of shade. The yelping was a chaotic chorus now, a frenzy of canine bloodlust, and through it all she could still hear the child's desperate sobs. "Dear Lord, protect me," she whispered her prayer, a puff of white in the hot air. She hitched up her skirts and began to run the rifle, feeling both heavy and reassuring in her grip. The tall prairie grass whipped at her legs, and her lungs burned, but the image of a child, any child being torn apart by those scavengers, propelled her forward. As she drew closer, the scene came into horrifying focus. A small boy, no older than 5 or 6, was backed up against the gnarled trunk of a cottonwood tree. He was cornered. A pack of 5 coyotes, their fur mangy and their eyes gleaming with hunger, circled him. They were darting in and out, nipping at the air, their movements a fluid, deadly dance. One, the largest of the pack, lunged, and the boy shrieked, swinging a desperate tiny fist. But it was the boy's appearance that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. His skin was the color of rich copper, his straight black hair cut in a style she'd only seen in illustrations of wanted posters back east. He wore only a breechcloth, and his small, bare chest was heaving with terror. He was a Comanche. A jolt of fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. The stories she'd heard, whispered in hushed tones by settlers, flooded her mind. Tales of raids, of brutality of a people who were the sworn enemies of the white man, encroaching on their land. The Comanches were a source of constant underlying dread, the reason every settler kept a gun close and an ear to the ground. But the boy wasn't a warrior. He was a child. His face streaked with tears and dirt, his dark eyes wide with a terror that transcended race and language. In that moment, he was not a Comanche. He was just a little boy about to die. Isabella's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. The alpha coyote lunged again this time, tearing a piece of the boy's breechcloth. The child stumbled, and the pack surged forward, sensing the kill. "Get away from him!" Isabella screamed, her voice raw and powerful. The coyotes, startled by the sudden intrusion, backed away for a second, their heads turning in her direction. Their lips curled back, revealing yellowed teeth, and a low, menacing growl rumbled through their chests. Isabella raised the Winchester to her shoulder, the stock pressing hard against the bone. She'd fired it before at rabbits and the occasional rattlesnake, but never at something that looked back with such intelligent malice. Her hands were shaking, but she focused on the largest coyote, the leader of the pack. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a deafening crack that shattered the prairie silence. The coyote yelped a high, thin sound of pain and crumpled to the ground, its legs twitching. The other 4, stunned and confused, scattered, their bravado evaporating in the face of this new threat. Isabella quickly worked the lever action, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new one. The metallic shick-shack of the mechanism was a strangely comforting sound. She aimed again this time at a coyote that had paused to look back and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust behind the animal. But it was enough. The remaining coyotes, their nerve completely broken, tucked their tails and fled, disappearing into the tall grass as if they were ghosts. Silence descended once more, thick and heavy, broken only by the boy's ragged sobs. Isabella lowered the rifle, her arms aching from the tension. Her heart was pounding so hard, she felt it in her throat. She looked at the boy who was now huddled at the base of the tree, his small body shaking uncontrollably. Slowly, cautiously, she approached him. She kept the rifle ready, not out of fear of the child, but of the lingering possibility that the coyotes might return. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You're safe now." The boy looked up at her. His dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. He didn't understand her words, of course, but her tone seemed to register. He flinched as she got closer, pressing himself harder against the tree bark. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured, stopping a few feet away. She knelt down, a difficult and painful maneuver, with her belly in the way, and laid the rifle on the ground beside her, a gesture of peace. She held out her empty hands, palms up. He stared at her, his chest still hitching with residual sobs. He had a nasty scratch on his leg, where one of the coyotes had gotten close, a thin line of red welling up on his coppery skin. She could see the faint outline of his ribs, a sign that he hadn't had a decent meal in a while. Where were his people? What was he doing out here all alone? 1,000 questions raced through her mind, each one more troubling than the last. Saving the boy had been an instinct, but now, as she looked at him, a child of the feared Comanche alone and injured in the middle of the vast, hostile plains, she realized her ordeal had just begun. The silence she had once found so oppressive was now filled with the weight of an impossible choice, and the terrifying certainty that her act of mercy had set in motion a chain of events she could not possibly control. The sun began its slow, merciless descent, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The heat, though starting to wane, still radiated from the parched earth. Isabella remained kneeling, a statue of cautious patience, as the Comanche boy watched her with an unblinking intensity that was unnerving in one so young. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a chasm of culture, language, and deeply ingrained fear. She knew she couldn't leave him here. The coyotes might return with the cover of darkness, or worse, he could wander off and succumb to the elements. But bringing a Comanche child, even one so small and helpless, into her home, felt like inviting a lightning strike. The stories weren't just stories. They were warnings paid for in blood. She remembered the smoldering ruins of the Parker homestead, a tale told to frighten new arrivals, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of this land. Yet looking at the boy at the tear tracks, carving paths through the dust on his cheeks, and the way he cradled his scratched leg, her maternal instinct amplified by the life stirring inside her, overwhelmed the fear. He was just a child, a lost, terrified child. "Come," she said softly, her voice a gentle murmur. She pointed to herself. "Isabella." Then she gestured towards her cabin, a faint silhouette against the darkening sky. "Home. Safe." The boy just stared, his black eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting the twilight. He didn't move a muscle. He was like a cornered fawn, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Isabella sighed. Words were useless. She needed to show him. Slowly wincing with the effort, she pushed herself back to her feet. She picked up the heavy Winchester, then turned and began walking back towards the cabin, her steps deliberate and unhurried. She didn't look back, not right away. She walked about 20 paces, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. Please, Lord, let him follow. She stopped and turned. For a long moment, the boy remained by the tree. Then, with a visible effort, he pushed himself away from the trunk. He took one hesitant step, then another, his gaze fixed on her. He was limping, favoring his short leg. He kept a wide distance, a small, solitary figure trailing a white woman across the immense, darkening landscape. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over Isabella. He was coming. By the time they reached the cabin, the first stars were beginning to prick the velvety blackness of the night sky. The air had cooled, and a cricket began its nightly serenade. Isabella pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, holding it open for the boy. He paused on the threshold, his eyes wide as he took in the strange enclosed space. The cabin was a single room, but it was Isabella's entire world. A cast-iron stove stood in one corner, its pipe rising through the ceiling. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat in the center. In the far corner was her bed, a simple frame with a patchwork quilt, and next to it a small unadorned cradle that Jebediah had finished just days before he died. The sight of it still sent a pang of grief through her. The boy's gaze lingered on the cradle, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He seemed wary of the enclosed space, of the unfamiliar smells of soap, wood smoke, and baking bread. Isabella moved to the stove and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. A warm golden glow filled the room, chasing the shadows into the corners. The boy flinched at the sudden light, but he didn't run. He took a tentative step inside, then another, as if testing the ground. "You must be hungry," she said more to herself than to him. She moved to the small pantry, a set of shelves curtained off with a piece of calico fabric. She had a little cornbread left from the day before and some jerky. It wasn't much, but it was something. She placed the food on a plate and set it on the table. Then she fetched a dipper of fresh, cool water from the bucket by the door. She pushed the plate gently towards the boy. He watched her every move, his suspicion a palpable force in the small room. He looked at the food, then back at her. He was clearly starving, but his pride or his fear held him back. Isabella understood. She pulled out a chair for herself, sat down, and broke off a piece of the cornbread, eating it slowly. She took a sip of water. She didn't look at him, giving him the space to make his own decision. After a few long, silent minutes, the gnawing hunger won out. The boy crept forward, his bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. He snatched a piece of jerky from the plate and retreated to the corner of the room near the door, before devouring it in ravenous bites. He ate the rest of the food the same way, quickly and warily, like a wild animal that expected its meal to be stolen at any moment. When he was finished, he looked at her, a glimmer of something other than fear in his eyes, gratitude, or perhaps just the simple satisfaction of a full belly. Now came the next challenge, his leg. Isabella went to the small chest at the foot of her bed, where she kept her meager medical supplies, some carbolic soap clean rags, and a jar of a foul-smelling but effective herbal salve that Martha Henderson had taught her how to make. She approached the boy slowly, showing him the supplies in her hands. "Your leg?" she said, pointing to the scratch. "It needs to be cleaned." He recoiled, dragging himself further into the corner, his eyes flashing with renewed fear. The memory of the coyote's teeth was still fresh. He likely thought she meant to harm him. Isabella sighed in frustration. This was like trying to gentle a wild colt. She knew she had to clean the wound. Infection in this land was a death sentence, swift and brutal. An idea came to her. She sat down on the floor a few feet away from him and lifted her own skirt just enough to reveal her ankle. Earlier in the week, she had scraped it on a rock by the creek. The wound was healing, but it was still visible. She dipped a clean rag in the water and began to dab gently at her own scrape. She winced a small, exaggerated sound, then applied a tiny bit of the salve. "See," she said, looking at him. "It helps." The boy watched her, his head tilted. He seemed to be processing her actions, his young mind trying to make sense of this strange woman and her even stranger world. After she finished tending to her own minor injury, she held out the clean, wet rag to him. She didn't move closer. She just waited. The silence stretched thick with unspoken questions. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, the boy crawled forward. He took the rag from her hand, his small fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting second. He looked at her one last time, as if seeking permission, then turned his attention to his own leg. His movements were clumsy, but he mimicked what she had done, cleaning the dirt and dried blood from the long, shallow scratch. He winced as the water touched the raw flesh, but he didn't cry out. A small, fragile bridge of trust had been built. It was a flimsy, precarious thing, but it was there. When he was done, she offered him the jar of salve. He hesitated again, then dipped a finger in and smeared the pungent green ointment onto the wound. The immediate crisis had passed. The boy was fed. His wound was tended to, and he was safe from the predators of the night. But as Isabella looked at him now, huddled in the corner again, his eyes growing heavy with sleep, a new and more terrifying thought began to form. His people, the Comanches, they would be looking for him. A child, especially a male child, was precious. They would not simply abandon him. And when they came, what would they find? Their son in the cabin of a lone white woman. What would they think? Would they understand that she had saved him? Or would they see a kidnapper, an enemy? The image of the smoldering Parker homestead flashed in her mind again, this time with a horrifying personal clarity. She imagined her own small cabin, the one Jebediah had built with such love and hope, consumed by flames. She imagined the cradle, waiting for her own child, turned to ash. The silence of the prairie returned, but now it was filled with the thunder of approaching hoofbeats, a sound that existed only in her mind, but was more real and more terrifying than any coyote's howl. She had saved a life, but in doing so, she may have just signed her own death warrant, and the life of her unborn child. She looked at the sleeping boy, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. His face in repose was angelic. He was innocent in all of this. But his innocence wouldn't protect her. She had crossed a line, a dangerous, invisible boundary that separated two worlds. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that there would be a reckoning. The prairie did not forgive such transgressions. Days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's relentless journey across the vast Texas sky. A strange, silent routine formed within the four walls of Isabella's cabin. The boy whom she had started to call Taco in her mind, a name she'd once heard a trapper use for a brave dog. The only word that came to mind that felt even remotely close to his world remained wary. But the sharp edges of his terror had begun to soften. He followed her like a shadow as she went about her daily chores. When she fed the chickens, he would stand by the coop, his dark eyes watching the birds with a quiet intensity. When she worked in her garden, pulling weeds from around the struggling squash and bean plants. He would sit in the shade of the cabin, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. He never spoke a word of his own language, and she had no words of his to offer. Their communication was a pantomime of gestures and expressions, a silent ballet of shared existence. He was a quick study. He learned to pump water from the well, his small arms straining with the effort, a look of fierce pride on his face when the water finally gushed forth. He helped her carry wood, his small loads, a comical imitation of her own. One afternoon, he found a small, smooth stone, and with a piece of charcoal from the fire pit, began to draw on its surface. He drew a stick figure of a woman, a round belly, prominent, standing over a series of sharp, jagged shapes that were unmistakably coyotes. Then he drew a boy next to her. It was his story, his memory of the rescue. Isabella's heart ached when she saw it. In these quiet moments, it was easy to forget the fear. It was easy to fall into the rhythm of this new, shared life. The cabin, once a monument to her loneliness, now felt full. The silence was no longer a predatory void, but a comfortable quiet filled with the soft sounds of two people living. She found herself humming old lullabies as she kneaded dough, her voice soft in the still air. For the first time since Jebediah's death, a fragile tendril of hope began to unfurl in her heart. But the fear was always there, a cold undercurrent beneath the surface of their peaceful routine. Every time she stepped outside, her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement for the telltale dust cloud of approaching riders. Every night, the distant howl of a coyote would jolt her awake, her hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester that now leaned against the wall by her bed. She knew her reprieve was temporary. The boy had been lost, but he wasn't an orphan. Somewhere out on that endless plain was a family, a tribe grieving for a lost son. And they were searching. She could feel it in the air, in the way the wind seemed to whisper warnings through the grass. The Hendersons were due for a visit. Martha tried to make the ride out once a month to check on her, to bring news and supplies. Isabella found herself both dreading and longing for their arrival. She needed the comfort of a friendly face, the sound of her own language, spoken by someone other than herself. But how could she possibly explain the boy? What would they think? What would they do? Report it to the nearest fort. That would surely bring a different kind of trouble. One that could be just as deadly. One morning, about a week after she had found the boy, the air changed. It was a subtle shift, a stillness that was different from the usual morning calm. The birds were quiet. The ever-present hum of insects seemed to have faded away. A heavy, expectant silence had fallen over the prairie. Isabella was standing on the porch, a basket of laundry on her hip, when she felt it. A low, deep vibration in the soles of her feet. It was a feeling more than a sound, a tremor that resonated up through her bones. Her blood ran cold. She knew that feeling. It was the earth trembling under the weight of many horses. Her eyes, wed with a sudden sickening dread, flew to the horizon, and there it was. A thin brown line of dust rising against the brilliant blue of the morning sky. It was far away to the north, but it was coming closer. And it was big. Too big to be the Hendersons' wagon. Too big to be a simple posse or a handful of trappers. "Taco!" She whispered, her voice tight with panic. The boy, who had been sitting on the steps whittling a piece of wood with a dull knife she had given him, looked up. He followed her gaze to the dust cloud, and his body went rigid. He stood up, the half-carved piece of wood falling from his hand. a look of profound recognition mixed with something she couldn't decipher. Fear-hope crossed his face. "Get inside," she said, her voice sharp. She grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the door. "Now." He didn't resist. He scurried inside the cabin, his eyes still fixed on the approaching cloud. Isabella followed, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. She slammed the heavy wooden door shut and slid the thick iron bolt into place. It was a flimsy defense against what was coming, but it was all she had. She ran to the small window next to the fireplace, the only window in the cabin, and peered out. The dust cloud was closer now, resolving itself into individual shapes. Riders. Dozens of them. They moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, their bodies as one with their horses. Her breath hitched in her throat. They were warriors. Even from this distance, she could see the glint of sun on rifle barrels and the feathered tips of lances held high. They were Comanches. She backed away from the window, her hand flying to her mouth. Her carefully constructed world, her fragile peace, was about to be shattered. They had found their boy, and they had come for him. She looked at Taco. He was standing in the middle of the room, his small body trembling. He wasn't looking at her, but at the door, his ears straining to catch the sounds. She could now hear the rhythmic, thunderous drumming of hoofbeats growing louder and louder. It's your people." She stammered the words, feeling like ash in her mouth. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The sound was deafening now, a rolling, earth-shaking roar. It seemed to come from all directions at once. Isabella risked another look out the window, and her heart stopped. They weren't just a line of riders anymore. They had fanned out, forming a massive, silent circle around her small cabin. They were everywhere. She counted 10, 20, 50. More. There must have been 100 of them. 100 painted warriors, their faces grim, impassive masks of war, sitting astride their powerful ponies. They held their weapons at the ready, their dark eyes fixed on the small, lonely cabin that held their son. They didn't shout. They didn't charge. They just sat there, a silent, menacing ring of brown skin leather and steel. The silence was more terrifying than any war cry. It was the silence of judgment, the silence of a predator that has its prey cornered and knows there is no escape. Isabella stumbled back from the window, her body shaking so violently she had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. Her gaze fell on the Winchester, leaning against the wall. One rifle, a handful of cartridges, against 100 of the most feared warriors on the plains. It was laughable. It was suicide. She looked at her belly, her hand moving to rest protectively over her unborn child. She had tried to do the right thing. She had saved a life. And her reward was this: to be surrounded, to be judged, and likely to be killed. The drumming of the hooves stopped. A new silence fell heavier and more absolute than any she had ever known. It was the silence of a world holding its breath. Outside, 100 warriors waited. Inside, a pregnant widow and a small boy stood on the precipice of a fate that had been sealed the moment she had fired that first shot at a pack of hungry coyotes. The storm had not just gathered, it had broken, and she was standing in its very eye. The silence stretched thin and taut, ready to snap. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of fear and old wood smoke. Isabella's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, a spring wound to its breaking point. Outside, the world was still. The 100 warriors sat motionless on their horses, a living, breathing wall of impending doom. They were waiting. But for what? She looked at Taco. The boy was no longer trembling. A strange calm had settled over him. He stood tall, his small shoulders squared, and faced the door. He seemed to be listening not with his ears, but with his entire being. Then a new sound. A single voice, deep and resonant, cut through the silence. It was a call, a name spoken in the guttural melodic tones of the Comanche language. "Tokia!" the boy. Taco flinched as if struck. His head whipped around, his eyes locking with Isabella's. In them, she saw a torrent of conflicting emotions. Relief, fear, and a plea she couldn't decipher. "Tokia!" The voice called again, closer this time. It was a voice of authority, a voice used to being obeyed. The boy looked at the bolted door, then back at Isabella. He took a hesitant step towards it. He knew that voice. It was his father. Isabella's mind raced a frantic scramble of impossible choices. Should she keep the door bolted, huddle in the corner, and pray for a miracle that would never come? Or should she open it and face the judgment of a man who had every reason to believe she was his enemy? Her hand rested on her swollen belly. She wasn't just fighting for her own life anymore. She looked at the boy, at his small, resolute face. He had trusted her. He had followed her here. He had cleaned his own wound because she had shown him how. He had drawn her picture on a stone. This fragile, unspoken bond between them was the only thing she had. It was a currency she had to spend. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, she walked to the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the heavy iron bolt. It felt impossibly cold to the touch. With a loud, grating screech that seemed to echo across the entire plain, she drew the bolt back. She pulled the door open. The sudden flood of bright morning light was blinding. She squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes. As her vision cleared, the scene before her solidified into a terrifying tableau. The circle of warriors was immense, a panorama of grim painted faces, leather and feathers. But her attention was drawn to the man directly in front of her, the one who had called the name. He sat astride a magnificent black stallion, a full head taller than the other ponies. He was a man in his prime, his bare chest crisscrossed with the faded white lines of old scars. His face was a mask of stern, unforgiving authority, his black hair long and braided with eagle feathers. A powerful bow was slung across his back, and a rifle rested in the crook of his arm. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were as black and as hard as obsidian, and they burned with a cold fire of grief and fury. This was a chief, a war chief, and he was staring at her as if she were a snake he was about to crush under his heel. The boy Tokia pushed past her and ran out onto the porch. "Papa!" he cried, his voice small and thin in the vast open space. The chief's iron expression cracked. The fury in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a wave of overwhelming relief. He swung himself off his horse with a fluid grace that belied his size and knelt, opening his arms. The boy ran into his embrace, burying his face in his father's chest. The chief held his son. His eyes closed, muttering words in their own tongue, words of comfort and love. For a moment he was not a fearsome warrior, but simply a father who had found his lost child. The other warriors remained silent, their gazes unwavering, their expressions unreadable. They were watching Isabella. The tender moment was fleeting. The chief, his name, Comanche leader, Quanah, came to mind, but she dismissed it as a flight of fancy. It couldn't be him, released his son, and stood up, his full height, seeming to block out the sun. His gaze fell upon the boy's leg, on the faint red line of the scratch, now clean and coated with her green salve. His eyes narrowed, and the hardness returned colder and more menacing than before. He spoke, his voice low and dangerous, not to her, but to the warrior standing beside him. The warrior dismounted and walked towards the cabin, his movements predatory and silent. Isabella's heart leaped into her throat. Was this it? Was this how it ended? The warrior didn't look at her. He stopped at the spot where she had shot the first coyote. He knelt, examined the ground, then picked something up. He walked back to the chief and held it out. It was the spent cartridge casing from her Winchester. The chief took the casing, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. He looked from the casing to the spot where the dead coyote had lain, and then finally his burning gaze settled on her. He spoke again, a string of harsh, guttural commands. 2 warriors dismounted and started towards her. This was it. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She backed away, stumbling into the cabin. Her eyes darted to Jebediah's rifle. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one she had. But before she could reach it, the boy Tokia did something unexpected. He let go of his father's hand and ran back to her, placing himself between her and the approaching warriors. He held up his small hands, palms out, and spoke in a rapid, high-pitched stream of Comanche. The warriors stopped in their tracks. The chief's eyes widened in surprise. The boy kept talking, his voice earnest and pleading. He pointed at Isabella, then at the spot by the creek. He made snarling, yapping sounds mimicking the coyotes. Then he pointed at the ground where the first coyote had fallen, and then back at Isabella, making a loud BAM sound. He pointed to his leg, then held up his hands to show how she had tended the wound. He was telling the story. He was telling them what had happened. As he spoke, another figure emerged from the ranks of the warriors. An old woman, her face a beautiful wrinkled map of a long life, her hair as white as snow, dismounted from her pony. She walked with the slow, deliberate grace of someone whose authority was unquestioned. She was Isabella, guessed the boy's grandmother, or a revered elder. She listened intently to the boy's story, her wise old eyes moving from her grandson to Isabella and back again. When he had finished a breathless torrent of words and gestures, the old woman turned to the chief. She spoke softly, her voice carrying a weight of wisdom and authority that even the fearsome war chief seemed to respect. He listened, his stony expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on Isabella. As the old woman spoke, the chief's eyes began to change. The cold fire of fury began to recede, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then grudging understanding, and finally something akin to respect. When the old woman finished, a new silence fell. The chief Comanche leader, Quanah, continued to stare at her, but the nature of his gaze had shifted. It was no longer the look of a predator at its prey. It was a look of assessment, of measurement. He was seeing her for the first time, not as a white intruder and enemy, but as the woman who had saved his son. He took a step forward, stopping just at the edge of the porch. He held up the spent rifle cartridge. He then pointed to the west towards the setting sun and spoke a single word in English, a word learned from traders and broken treaties, a word that hung in the air with the weight of a verdict. Brave. He then turned to his men and issued a sharp command. The 2 warriors who had been advancing on her backed away and remounted their horses. The chief swung himself back onto his black stallion, pulling his son up to sit in front of him. He looked at Isabella one last time. He gave a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledgement of a debt recognized. Then, with another command, he wheeled his horse around. And just like that, the great circle of warriors broke. As one, they turned their ponies and began to ride away, not with the frantic haste of a retreat, but with the proud, deliberate pace of a procession. The thunder of their hooves began again, but this time it was a sound of departure, a sound of life, not death. Isabella stood in the doorway of her cabin, her body trembling with the aftermath of her terror, and watched them go. She watched as the 100 warriors who had surrounded her home, who had held her life in their hands, became a dust cloud once more, receding into the vast, indifferent prairie until they were gone. She was alone again. The silence returned, but it was a different silence now. It was not the silence of dread or loneliness. It was the silence of survival, the silence of a debt paid and a life spared. She looked down at her hands, still shaking, and then at her belly. A tear, hot and heavy, rolled down her cheek and fell into the dust. It was a tear of terror, of relief, of a profound and weary understanding of the brutal, beautiful and unforgiving land she called home. The judgment of the plains had been passed, and against all odds, she had been found worthy. The dust settled. The thunder of hoofbeats faded into a memory, an echo on the wind. Isabella stood on her porch for a long time, watching the empty horizon until the sun was high in the sky, her body still humming with the ghost of her terror. The prairie seemed unnaturally quiet, as if it too were recovering from the morning's confrontation. The boy Tokia was gone. The cabin which had felt so full with his silent presence now seemed cavernously empty. The small whittled piece of wood he had dropped on the step was the only physical evidence he had ever been there. Isabella picked it up, her fingers tracing the rough, unfinished shape. It felt impossibly precious. A profound, bone-deep exhaustion settled over her, heavier than any physical labor she had ever endured. She went inside the familiar scent of her home, a comforting balm. Her eyes fell on the plate on the table, the one she had used to give the boy his first meal in her home. She looked at the corner where he had slept, the floorboards, still bearing the faint imprint of his small body. He had been a part of her life for only a week, yet his absence left a hole. She had faced down death. She had faced down 100 of the most feared warriors on the plains, and she had survived. But the encounter had changed her. The neat, simple lines she had once drawn between friend and foe, between safety and danger, had been blurred into a complicated, messy reality. She had looked into the eyes of the savage enemy and had seen a father's love and a chief's reluctant respect. Days turned into a week, then 2. The rhythm of her solitary life returned, but it was a different rhythm now. When she scanned the horizon, it was not with the same sharp-edged fear, but with a strange sense of connection. She was no longer just a trespasser on this land. She had become a part of its story. One afternoon, as she was tending her garden, she saw a rider approaching. Her heart gave a familiar jolt of alarm, but this was a different kind of rider. He was leading a pack mule, and he rode with the slumped, weary posture of a long-distance traveler. As he drew closer, she recognized the familiar, grizzled face of Silas Croft, a friendly trapper who passed through the area a few times a year on his way to the trading posts up north. "Afternoon, Mrs. Donovan," Silas called out, his voice a gravelly rumble. He tipped his dusty hat. "Just passing through. Thought I'd see if you were in need of anything." "Silas," she said, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "It's good to see you. Please get down. I can offer you some cool water." Silas dismounted, his old bones creaking in protest. He gratefully accepted the dipper of water she offered him. "Mighty quiet out here," he observed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Too quiet." "It has been," she agreed, her voice carefully neutral. Silas squinted at her, his pale blue eyes sharp and discerning. "Heard a story down at the fort. A wild one. About 100 Comanche warriors led by Quanah Parker himself, paying a visit to a lone settler's cabin out this way." Isabella's blood ran cold. Quanah Parker. It had been him, the most powerful and feared of all the Comanche chiefs, a man whose name was a legend on the plains. "They say," Silas continued, his voice dropping low, "that Parker's youngest boy, Little Raven, got himself lost in a storm. The whole nation was out looking for him. They tracked him here, to this cabin." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the hot, still air. "Story goes, they found the boy safe and sound. Found he'd been saved from a coyote pack by the woman in the cabin, a pregnant widow." He looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "They say Quanah Parker, a man who ain't known for his kindness to our kind, called off his warriors and rode away. Left the woman unharmed. Said she had a brave heart." Isabella said nothing. She just stared at him, her mind reeling. The story was already traveling, carried on the wind, like a prairie fire, becoming a part of the land's folklore. "Folks at the fort are calling it a miracle," Silas said, shaking his head. "I ain't much for miracles, but I'll be damned if this don't come close." He looked around at the small, vulnerable cabin, at the vast, empty plains, stretching out in every direction. "You got a guardian angel, Mrs. Donovan? Or you're tougher than you look?" "Perhaps a little of both," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Silas stayed for a while, sharing news from the wider world, but Isabella barely heard him. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events, seeing them now through the lens of this new information. Quanah Parker, Little Raven. The names gave a solid, terrifying reality to what had happened. After Silas had gone riding off towards the north, Isabella walked to the edge of her property, to the spot where the great circle of warriors had been. The grass was already springing back, the hoofprints fading, but the memory was seared into the landscape, into her soul. She stood there for a long time, watching the sun set, painting the sky in the same fiery colors as it had on the day she had saved the boy. And as the first stars began to appear, she noticed something at her feet. It was a small, flat stone, the same kind Little Raven had used for his drawing. But this one was different. It was smooth and dark, and etched into its surface was a single elegant figure, a soaring eagle. It hadn't been there before. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the deeply carved lines. It was a gift, a sign, a message left for her, a silent acknowledgement of the debt between a powerful chief and a lone, pregnant widow. It was an echo of the thunder, a promise whispered on the wind. A few weeks later, Martha and John Henderson finally made it out for their visit, their wagon rattling up to the cabin. They brought with them supplies and a torrent of worried questions, having heard the same wild story from Silas on the trail. Isabella, for the first time, told them everything, the words pouring out of her, a release of the fear and tension she had held inside for so long. Martha wept, clutching her hand, while John, a man of few words, just shook his head in silent, stunned amazement. "You should have come with us, Isabella," Martha said, her voice choked with emotion. "It's not safe for you out here alone." Isabella looked around at her small cabin, at the vast open land, that had almost claimed her. She felt the weight of the eagle stone in her apron pocket. "This is my home," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Jebediah and we chose this place. And I think the land has chosen me too." She had faced the worst the prairie could throw at her, and she had endured. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a part of this place, her story woven into its fabric. The fear was not gone, but it had changed. It had become a kind of respect, a deep and abiding understanding of the precarious balance of life and death, of courage and consequence. Months later, as the first chill of autumn touched the air, Isabella went into labor. Alone in her cabin, with only the memory of Jebediah and the spirit of 100 silent warriors as her witnesses, she brought a new life into the world. A son. She named him Jedediah after his father, but his middle name was Quanah, as she held her newborn son. His tiny fingers wrapped around her own, she looked out the window at the vast, endless prairie. It was still a wild and untamed land, a place of harsh beauty and sudden violence. But it was no longer just a place of loss and loneliness. It was a place of courage, of unexpected grace, and of a bond forged in fire between a pregnant widow and a Comanche chief. It was her home. And for the first time, she felt truly at peace. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the promise of a future, a story to be told, and the quiet, steady beating of two brave hearts. The story of Isabella May Donovan and the Comanche boy isn't just a tale of survival. It's a testament to the human spirit's capacity for courage in the face of impossible odds. It reminds us that empathy is a language that transcends all barriers, and that a single act of bravery can ripple outwards, changing not just one life, but the course of history, however small. Isabella's ordeal on the Texas plains shows that even in the most hostile of environments, a connection can be forged and respect can be earned through actions, not words. Her legacy and that of the child she bore is a powerful reminder of the unexpected bonds that can form in the crucible of the American West. If this story of courage, survival, and unexpected grace moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with others who appreciate powerful historical dramas, and subscribe to our channel for more true stories from the wild heart of history. Your support allows us to continue bringing these incredible narratives to light. Thank you for listening.